Never figured I would have to start taking up drinking until now. Y'all better enjoy this shit. Oh yes, what has thy have wrought? Now being way too deep into these classic reviews after reviewing the original Sam Raimi trilogy, and then divulging into the very first outing from Andrew Garfield and director Mark Webb, I think it's necessary to kind of catch up, save face, and dive into the bastard child that is Amazing Spider-Man 2. Because we can't go into the echelon of what everybody considers to be the perfect Spider-Man in the form of Tom Holland with his interpretation in Civil War, Homecoming, Infinity War, and the upcoming Far From Home. We need to take the good with the bad. And so we need to get really deep and gritty into what exactly failed about The Amazing Spider-Man 2, at least from my perspective, because it has been 4 years since this version of Spidey, and this was actually one of the reasons for why I didn't want to do the Andrew Garfield movies, because they were just so recent, most especially this one, because it's 2014. It doesn't really feel like it's something that is going to really change too much in a matter of just 4 years, and goddamn was I right. But so many different little kind of analytical interpretations and different little things of what could have been did get kind of formed as I watched this movie and jotted down all my notes. So now let's take a look at some of them that I managed to kind of pile together with my classic review of Amazing Spider-Man 2. So even though it wasn't exactly every single person's cup of tea, Amazing Spider-Man fared very well both critically and commercially, so it was kind of a no-brainer that Sony was going to pull together Mark Webb, Andrew Garfield, and Emma Stone to come back for Amazing Spider-Man 2, and they announced that Electro was going to be the center villain played by, out of all people, Jamie Foxx. However, at the time, I think the majority of us thought that, okay, that was a really weird casting choice, but I think it could work. And then months proceeded, filming began, and then more and more images kind of rose from the set, some of which included Harry Osborn, played by Dane DeHaan, and then we had Paul Giamatti in a suit that looked a little mechanical, and then there was the man with the fedora walking around. We got some trailers, we got some poster art, and then little by little our worries started to kind of rise, and then just little by little we start to think, how exactly are they going to make something really good out of just so much that, like, the writings were on the wall, or at least on the web. So going in, we saw the movie. I gave my initial review back in 2014. I think you can still check it out on this channel, and feel free to do so after watching this review to see the comparisons, because I can't even fucking remember what I said, except that it kind of somewhat mirrors about what I'm about to mention, except here I'm about to break it down scene by scene. Alright, so we got the studio logos, as every movie tends to have. We got the Columbia logo, check. Marvel logo, check. Oh, this one's a new one. I didn't know that we're doing a Lionsgate movie. Oh, whoa. It's not a logo? Okay, that was fucking weird. So the movie, quite frankly, starts off with a certain level of intrigue by going back to the mysterious nature of Peter Parker's parents, most notably Richard Parker, who's inside of Oscorp. He escapes, having found something rather nefarious. And it's cool that they also showed a little bit of the original Amazing Spider-Man, only this time, instead of sticking with Peter and then flashing forward, we actually stay with the parents. And then some shit goes down, and you're the entire time now rewatching this thing, I'm thinking to myself, man, fuck Spider-Man. I kind of want to stick with these parents, because they're pulling off like these fighting moves. I mean, they're dealing with these guys with guns, and they're in some secret espionage shit, and then the plane starts to go twisty-turny. I'm like, damn, imagine if we had just stuck with this. But then that Spider logo appears, and we're back to Spidey. Now, right off the bat, you can clearly tell that they took in stride one little criticism that I think an awful lot of people had with Amazing Spider-Man, myself included, and that's cool. That's a really good way to kind of open up your movie, and that's Spidey having a brand new suit. The texture is a little bit different, the webbing is a little different, most notably the eyes look a little less sinister and dark than they did in the first movie. He looks a little bit more like he was lifted from the comics. Hell, even the Todd McFarlane version of Spidey kind of resembles that somewhat with the eyes. So I was glad to see that with his costume, but it still looked like it can be partially homemade. And then we get those visuals of him swinging through the city that are reminiscent of the first movie, with the first person shots and him using his acrobatics and his different style of maneuvering himself, different from the Tobey Maguire version. And I was like, okay, cool. And then this happens. Even though this scene is a little bit of a juxtaposition to the previous scene that we had with Richard Parker and his mother, where I thought that was really intriguing, this was just more dumb, cartoony fun. But I mean that in the fondest way, where I was watching this going, wow, this actually does feel lifted from either the comics or most notably the cartoons, where, yeah, it's cartoony, Spidey's very obviously CG swinging throughout the city, and he's doing some antics that are very clownish and over the top, but in a very Spider-Man sort of way that feels faithful. The way that he's taunting the Russian mobster and he's in the back of the car catching all those levels of plutonium. Why is it always plutonium? Why do the screenwriters have a fucking fetish for plutonium? I don't know. Ever since Back to the Future, it's been a thing. However, here Spidey trying to follow this entire robbery does feel like something that I would expect from a cartoon like the 90s cartoon, or mainly one of the most recent cartoons, like I dare say even Ultimate Spider-Man, but also Spectacular Spider-Man, where I'm like, yeah, this is a little over the top, but I'm kind of enjoying it. I just wish that we didn't waste great Oscar-nominated talent like Paul Giamatti. He's just too good for this, in such a thankless role that it's done and over in just about 5 minutes, until later on, which I'll tackle much later when I'm almost about to be done looking at the movie. However, this entire opening act does put me in a really good Spidey mood and really reimburses the fact that Andrew Garfield really was good as Spider-Man. He's got the quips, he's got the antics, he's got the humor. A number of times he would make me laugh during this first opening segment, and I was like, okay, cool, I can actually watch that week to week if it was a show. But the movie must not forget that he is both Spidey and Peter, and of course one of the big gravitating things, one of the more nuanced things about him as a character is that he's trying to balance real life with being a superhero, and that's what makes him relatable. We kind of get a little inkling of that when he's trying to make the graduation, filled with a rather gratuitous Stan Lee cameo. It's funny how Deadpool poked fun at the Stan Lee cameo as a gratuitous cameo during the opening title sequence of that movie, yet it felt much more gratuitous here, where he's literally just, I don't know, there's just something about the way they cut to it that just seems very forced, and that's really a lot to say about a Stan Lee cameo, where it's just like, oh yeah, we gotta put him in there, just put him in the bleachers, just put that guy, he's not gonna know what he's doing, and that's how it's kind of felt. Anyways, they move on to the graduation, and we kind of get the whole Gwen Stacy dynamic, where he's got the chemistry, they both have that oozing, nauseating chemistry that's very likable to see on screen. It's almost like these two, despite the fact that they were dating in real life, it's like the cameras were never really on, and it was just them in real life. So it's like, okay, cool, I guess you were acting, not really, but it works for the chemistry. But most notably, it kind of reminds us about the struggles that Peter was having from the first movie that you definitely want to include in a Spider-Man movie, where Peter is dealing with Gwen Stacy and having to deal with that promise that he made to Captain Stacy, leading to him seeing Dennis Leary all over the place. I would be scared shitless too if I saw Dennis Leary looking at me that way every single place that I go. And seemingly for a while, it's like the movie was on a right track, because personally I feel like the way this movie opened, setting the tone with the action, and then Peter diving into the struggles he's having with Gwen Stacy and trying to keep her safe, while at the same time things at home with Aunt May after the passing of Uncle Ben, somewhat tying to the mysterious nature of Peter and that briefcase once more that returns to haunt him, and exactly why it is that they abandoned him in the first place. All those things kind of coupled together would have made a very significantly better screenplay for a sequel. Something that would have felt different. It wouldn't have tackled the villain of the week, even though it'll eventually have to, but it'll at least serve as a really strong backbone for a sequel. Like, you used the first movie to establish that Peter's parents were up to something shady, and here it just kind of explores it even deeper, while at the same time him trying to defeat this villain. Just like Spider-Man 2 kind of was dealing with a new villain in the form of Doc Ock, but at the same time, it was somewhat tied, or at least complementing, the inner struggle that Peter was having, which is to balance real life and the love of his life with being Spider-Man and dealing with this villain. And I think they could have replicated that somehow. But then, within that opening act that I was kind of praising, we got the introduction to Max Dillon. And the movie continues to return to Max Dillon, played by Jamie Foxx. And this is the hapless soul that's going to turn into our main villain later on. Here's the thing though. The movie, at this point, tries uber extra hard to make Max Dillon a tragic character, because he ends up being a tragic character in the comics, and even in some of the animated interpretations that he had. Hell, I'll even say that the MTV Spider-Man made Max Dillon a tragic character. He didn't have an awful lot going for him, but there was a sliver of me, just a tiny inkling of me that actually felt kind of bad, because there were moments where he was somewhat of a decent person to Peter Parker. Like, he wasn't an asshole, but he was just kind of like, hey, you know, cool, it's whatever, I'm just trying to get by. And he kind of gives a girl a certain look where it's just like, hey, you know, I might have found the one. And that was in that show, and that's not a show that's very fun for an awful lot of Spidey fans. So to say that Amazing Spider-Man 2 was just trying too hard, way too hard, to make Max Dillon such a, oh, poor him, sympathetic character, it backfired completely, where he just seems not only immensely pathetic, but also a little bit psychotic in his obsession with both Spider-Man and just the way that he wants everybody to acknowledge him. To the point where maybe there's a reason for why people don't acknowledge him, because people have learned from their mistakes, saying, dude, this guy's not letting me go anywhere.
Dylan, you're late.
Hey, it's BJ Novak, who played a douchebag in The Office, and he's here playing a douchebag. God, he's so good at it. I want to kick his fucking ass.
Jamie Foxx, you know, no fault to him, because he was playing the character just right. It's here where it's like, okay, it's not the smooth, you know, usual, typical character that you've seen Fox play before. Okay, it's somewhat different, but it's not exactly doing the script any favors writing this character this way. Shortly after that, the Osborns are introduced, and they were hinted at in the first movie, but here you actually get to see Chris Cooper as Norman Osborn, and then Dane DeHaan make his introduction as Harry Osborn. And the two of them, sure, they do look like father and son, and they do kind of have similar personality traits, but just the way they're introduced, not only does it come right off the heels of the introduction of Max Dillon, and maybe even somewhere in there his accident, I'm having an even tough time remembering, and I saw this movie last night, but then they bring forward a bullshit disease that Norman Osborn has that lead us into the subplot with Harry Osborn as to why he's in the movie in the first place.
Retroviral hyperplasia.
It just doesn't equate. It just doesn't equate to be in this movie, or at least be in this movie along with this subplot. Maybe if he was just simply introduced, he was in town for like a meeting or whatever, he has a couple of meetings with Peter, then that would have been fine, but just trying to tackle too much at this point is immensely overwhelming, because if I'm not mistaken, we have now hit the 30 or 35-ish minute mark. We got Max Dillon, we got the Osborns, we got Peter seeing Captain Stacy everywhere and trying to deal with his on and off again relationship with Gwen Stacy. You got him trying to catch as many criminals as he possibly can with some rather entertaining montages where he's going around. At one point he's sick, but he still has to continue being Spider-Man, and it's funny and it's entertaining, it's cool, but you got all these things mounted together on top of the Parker mystery. Guys, I was trying to take notes, and at this point I had to pause the movie to remember exactly what just happened so I can write it down on my iPod, on my iPod, as my phone, as I'm trying to jot it down and memorize it, because one thing is just flying over another, and it's not necessarily a brand new thing that I'm rediscovering here watching the movie 4 years later. It was a problem from the beginning, from when we saw the movie in the theaters to when we were watching the trailer and seeing little inklings of what was to come, from Electro to even some hints at the Green Goblin, and even going back to that trailer spoiling the fact that in the background you see certain gadgets from other villains. It's just like, it's too fucking much. Eventually, amongst all of this, Electro is finally born, and I will admit, the actual visual flair to Electro is actually kind of cool. I've always appreciated the look that they gave Electro in this movie. I knew that the yellow sparks and the green suit, I just personally didn't think that was going to work in a live action setting, so I actually dug the approach to Electro, him being all blue, because that's usually what you kind of, the color palette that you associate with electricity, and him having some kind of containment suit that, yeah, I'll admit it's going to look generic, but it's the only thing that's really going to make an awful lot of sense in a live action setting. So him And then the way that Jamie Foxx was able to kind of transform himself, I was like, all right, that was pretty neat. And again, the visual flair to that entire sequence in no other place to kind of take place in other than Times Square, where you got the most electrical devices taking up the majority of the city's power, or I dare say even the country, which is Times Square with those giant screens. It only made sense. So him going up against Spidey and the way that they used electricity, even some of the slow-mo shots, and again, Spidey with his quips, it was a really good altercation that they both had that I'll admit was entertaining. Personally, however, I could have done without the soundtrack. I mean, that's not to say that the score in this movie is not that bad, because it's done by Hans Zimmer as well as his team of musicians, and they did a pretty good job taking over James Horner from the first movie. But what was up with the whole whispering? I mean, it's funny because they didn't establish that he was dealing with any kind of psychosis, mainly because the voice that you're hearing where he's like, they're dead, like they're going to a musical beat. They're doing it to a musical beat. And it just came off as weird, like not in a great way, but just overly weird, and also very over expositional on top of the exposition that we've already been piled on a number of levels. I just didn't find it necessary. But thanks to Spidey's quick thinking of using a water hose just so they can wear that firefighter's hat, Electro unfortunately gets sidelined for a really good majority of the movie after this point. It was cool that we got the sequence, but he's just out of the picture for a hefty chunk of the movie, up until later on where plots get kind of in a woman. Afterwards, we go back to the Richard Parker mystery, except with this really weird out of the blue montage using one of the more popular songs at the time, that fucking what's his name, Philip Phillips, that song. I remember sitting in the theater and going, you have got to be fucking kidding me. I am sick of this song. It's on the radio every day, and now it's here. Great. It's a good thing that I suffer from a very, very bad case of overdone earwax. It's at this point when once more the script is fighting with itself, and I gotta be honest, again, I saw this movie last night, and it's hard to keep track of all these things. I was trying to jot down notes. All I know is that after this point, we go back to the Peter parents mystery with the subway station, and then at some point we go back to Harry Osborn and his mystery disease and why he needs Spidey's blood, and the fact that he gets angry over over Peter, and then also some big Oscorp cover-up that Gwen Stacy is getting herself involved in. Again, it's just too much. Pick one. And what's even sadder is that lost along this entire shuffle is Sally Field playing Aunt May with her little minor subplot about trying to make ends meet so that Peter can go off to college and have a good life, and her also trying to keep herself busy after the tragic events of Uncle Ben. And it's Sally Field here where it's like, it's The Amazing Spider-Man 2, and yes, she gives some really quality acting, more so than this movie ultimately deserves. And that's a testament to her acting, because out of all these scenes, just go intercut one after another with all these different plots fighting for the screen time, it's Sally Field during her scene where she finally tells Peter, hey, fuck you, you're off trying to find your dead parents, and yet here I am trying to make your breakfast, trying to wash your clothes, trying to do all these things. What about me? And it's rather heartbreaking, and it's almost like that's maybe the true writer of the original movie, or even the director trying to kind of interpret. It's almost like an analogy there for the real gold of the matter that could ultimately make a great Spidey movie, and yet either the studio heads or the people who wrote this movie, which I'll get to later, are just too busy looking at all the bigger, flashier things that they're not acknowledging what really matters, which is raw emotion. And that's what Sally Field was able to bring, at least to that scene, and that's what makes her one of the unsung heroes in the movie.
What are you doing?
When did you do this?
You did it during the montage when he was doing it to the beat of Philip Phillips' Gone, 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 which was one of the more top-charting singles.
But of course, the movie says fuck all that and continues switching around. Peter, as Spidey, rejects Harry Osborn of his offer to give him his blood, making him angry, giving him a vendetta versus Spidey, which sets up a little something later on, with or without possibly, maybe, just sorta, kinda, maybe, Black Cat in the form of Felicia, played by Felicity Jones here. I mean, you don't just cast Felicity Jones, it's just the thankless role like that, so it's gotta mean something, right? You got Peter and Gwen continuing to struggle with the relationship, and then you got Electro making a proclamation that things are gonna go bad for them.
Okay, here I am 4 years later, and I still get eared out by this guy's lips. They're fucking gross. Look, ugh.
That could have made for an interesting stinger to have at the end of Amazing Spider-Man 2, rather than being here in the middle. And here's why. Because shortly hereafter, it's the entire cover-up that gets ultimately revealed to Harry Osborn by the people over at Ravencroft, where they're experimenting on all these different things, that I think could have made for a really cool plot for a third movie if all of that was just shoved over there. Because think about it. Harry getting introduced in this movie and Electro simply just being the main villain, and then having his fights with Peter, and then maybe killing off a side character that Peter cared about, ultimately raising the stakes and making things much more nail-biting, leading to a climax where Electro doesn't get killed but gets defeated, and then gets put into that situation where he makes that proclamation in front of the Doctor saying, you know, a world without Spider-Man. This is what will then show Harry, what Harry will discover in that little video clip, and that's where this whole entire Ravenclaw cover-up can become like the ultimate plot of the third movie. And it could have been like a spy thriller, only in the Spider-Man universe. That actually would have been nice. All of that combined with Peter discovering that it was Richard Parker who in fact unveiled the Ravenclaw conspiracy in the first place, and then Harry as the Green Goblin and Electro team up for the third movie, only this time, since we fleshed out Electro, he can kind of be killed off halfway through that third movie, and then the remaining half of that third movie, it could be Harry Osborn versus Spidey, and they both know each other's identities. And if Electro had been developed better, and by that I mean if he wasn't the creepy, really pathetic, really, you know, overdone character that he was in this one, and more so that tragic one where you felt sorry for him. You wanted him to take a better route with his life. You wanted him to go the way of Spidey, where he used his powers for good after dealing with a tragic event, whether it be bitten by a spider or his Uncle Ben being killed. Here, being charged up with electricity and never having a normal life ever again. Wishing for that, his return in Amazing Spider-Man 3 would have been warranted, earned. It would have felt awesome because you like him as a villain, you can find his reasoning. Again, a great villain is one that you can understand where they're coming from. It's hard to argue against their methods, against their way of thinking, and that's what could have worked with Electro, because he's one of the easiest ones to do this way. And Spectacular Spider-Man was able to do that, and like I said, even MTV Spider-Man was able to do that. However, that wasn't simply the case, and again, it was just more so the script just trying to get things kind of here and done and kind of out of the way, thus leading us into the climax where we do have Electro going up against Spidey one more time in the most electrical fashion ever at the Power Grid. And sure, it's visually stimulating, don't get me wrong, there's some cool little shots here with the electricity zapping Spidey and then him swinging, and it's more visual flair that makes me go, okay, that actually might have been kind of neat to watch in 3D, except for some soundtrack choices again with electro type music with the Itsy Bitsy Spider and all that. However, it was still rather neat that this climax was entertaining. It included some rather neat stakes. I appreciated the two planes almost colliding with each other, because that's a very nuanced consequence, because if the power goes out, then obviously towers are not going to be able to navigate that air traffic. So okay, cool, that makes sense. I'm glad that they included that. And again, sure, by the end it leads to a traditional fix from Blockbusters where it's like, oh, you know, we could zap the energy tenfold and zap, you know, it's just Spidey gets rid of the bad guy, and it doesn't change up really here. It's entertaining. It's got some neat little bits of humor with Spidey and Gwen and her inclusion in there, but it's nothing necessarily out of the norm for a blockbuster, most especially a Spidey one. It is then when the Green Goblin appears after Harry injecting himself with that previous version of the Lizard serum or whatever the hell that was that turned him into the Goblin.
Well, wait a minute. Arrhenius Asclepius? Really, guys? You're so vain, you probably think this spider's about you?
I mean, forget his transformation. How in the hell is his shirt just popping holes there? It's like it's melting. What the hell's happening there? Anyways, he appears with his brand new armor and glider, and and one of the most forced cackles I can hear, where it's like, wow, you Willem Dafoe, you are not. And once again, this entire fight, this entire interaction is just tacked on and forced, because this would have been awesome to witness in Amazing Spider-Man 3 with Harry's inclusion in this one with some stepping stones of development, but his vitriol towards Spidey/Peter is not 100% there. It's not until the third movie where it kind of fully pops and sends him over the deep end. That's what would have been cool. Except, again, the screenwriters, and most notably, the Sony Columbia Pictures executives saying, put this in there. Put it in the poster, no less.
By the way, you may not know, but you and your family will be held hostage if you do not buy Sony product after watching this movie. Because Jesus Christ, the Sony products.
That's where you put it. And yeah, we end up with another CG fest on top of the tower, but we can't exactly negate every single thing that comes out of this movie, because one of the more interesting facets of this movie comes in the form of death, let alone from the Green Goblin fight, and that is one of the more faithful adaptations from the Spidey comics that we have seen in the movies, and it's actually one that's done with certain panache, certain respect, that I'm like, okay, it's almost like for a moment there, the writers actually began to write, and the director was able to seize control once more. And that's, of course, in the scene of Gwen Stacy's death. One of the bold moves that even back when I watched the movie in 2014, I thought to myself, damn, they went there. And what makes the scene very effective is that, one, it's done in a very dramatic style with the slow-mo and the clock gears falling all around her. And I'll admit, it's a little cheesy to have the web kind of extend like a hand. I'm like, okay, yeah, I get the metaphor. But everything else works so much with it, actually, that I'm willing to kind of just overlook that completely. It's a nitpick at this point. And it's done well, and it's effective because you actually liked these people. Again, Gwen Stacy, played by Emma Stone, was actually one of the shining diamonds out of these two movies. So to see her fall to her death is actually rather effective. It does make you kind of care and go, oh man, out of all the very daring choices you have to make, you actually have to go with Gwen Stacy's death out of all people, because this is one that happens to a person that you liked, and B, you actually went with your guns on a foreshadowed promise, which is that of Captain Stacy from the ending of the first movie, and now this kind of comes full circle. You know what that's called? That's called payoff. And payoffs happen in great scripts. So to see it in Amazing Spider-Man 2, you bet your ass that it was a surprise. Here's the thing though. After careful analyzation, the movie would have been actually rather appreciative if it had just ended there. With Gwen Stacy's death, with the funerals, and maybe with a little bit of foreboding to Peter eventually returning to the spandex of becoming Spider-Man once more. Because it kind of comes with the territory that, yeah, seeing him just mourn in front of that tombstone for months on end after all the seasons pass by, I think we kind of get the gist that he hasn't been Spider-Man for a while. And sure, we got that news anchor telling us so. Again, exposition. It would have been neat that the movie would have ended with him watching Gwen Stacy's commencement speech and him looking at the Spidey costume and then just cutting right there. Directed by Mark Webb. That actually would have been a neat little effective twist on the usual way that you would end your blockbusters. But this is Sony. And this was already a convoluted script to begin with. You know damn fucking well that's not going to happen. And sure enough, the last 10 minutes of this movie are some of the most tacked on, maybe even more so than Venom at the end of Spider-Man 3, one of the most tacked on endings for a Spidey movie or even a comic book superhero movie to boot. And that is Peter watching on the news that a mechanical rhino has now rampaged through the city, and it's none other than the Russian guy played by Paul Giamatti from the beginning of the movie, because he was given the suit by the mysterious dude from the first movie under the orders of Harry Osborn, who wants to put together a villainous team. Give me a fucking break.
Bad Parenting 101.
To make matters worse, Peter comes out of retirement as Spidey. Everybody's happy to see him. which again could have been cool to see at the beginning of Spider-Man 3, Amazing Spider-Man 3, and then the movie ends. That money shot from the trailer ends up being the final shot of the movie. Yeah. Not much has exactly changed from my first viewing of Amazing Spider-Man 2. Sure, I can come up with different theories as to what could have been and exactly what were the initial problems of Amazing Spider-Man 2, but the best way to summarize it all together is that Amazing Spider-Man 2 is one of the more definitive examples of a corporate movie decision. It's not even a movie, it's a corporate decision. It's an amalgamation of corporate decisions upon corporate decisions from many aspects of the movie. Just think about it. You got 3 different screenwriters, 2 of which are Roberto Orci and Alex Kurtzman, who went on to do more and more of the Transformers sequels. And none of these 3 writers are the original writer, James Vanderbilt, who did Amazing Spider-Man. You got a different cinematographer who completely changed up the aesthetics from the first one. The first one had a much more subdued look to the entire movie. You know, it just had a different feel to the entire thing. Here it's Dan Mandel, who would normally do J.J. Abrams movies with the lens flares and all that stuff, and you can kind of see some much more brighter contrast, lesser subdued, more in-your-face color correction, color timing. And then we have a different composer, as I mentioned before. Hans Zimmer took over James Horner's original score, and you kind of tell that from the opening notes. It's not a bad score, but it's much more bombastic than what you're normally used to. You even got some end credits that are lesser subtle than the first ones, where it's very, you know, very flashy, and you even got another pop song playing in the background with those. And then you got schematics of the Sinister Six weapons in the background playing during all of these things. And then, of course, there is the tragic soul at the center of it all, Mark Webb, whose nuance and very cool and down-to-earth directing from the little bit of earnest feelings that I saw, earnest directing that I saw from the first movie, is nowhere to be found here. Because, sure, you open up with some of those POV shots of Spidey swinging through the city, but immediately we get this action scene that is somewhat reminiscent of a Michael Bay movie. Because you got the shaky cams, you got the in-your-face kind of cuts. There's no real Mark Webb style found throughout the entirety of this movie. And that's because at that point Mark Webb became a director for hire. It wasn't Mark Webb's movie. It was Sony's movie. And that's because all they saw was dollar signs in the future of what they could set up to rival that of the actual congruent Marvel that was already setting up the MCU with their second phase of movies after Avengers. Let's go ahead and try to do that. That was your first mistake, Sony. And the second one was Amazing Spider-Man 2. However, there are certain diamonds to be found in the huge leaps of coal rough that is this movie. But they're not enough to really make me, like, think to myself, like, wow, I'll be happy if I die tomorrow, knowing that I will never have to watch this movie again. So I'm going to be giving Amazing Spider-Man 2 a very low 6 out of 10. I honestly cannot remember if that was the exact same rating that I gave it back in 2014, but one thing's for sure, this movie has not aged well, and something tells me that it's not going to. Thank the Lord Almighty, we have Tom Holland now, and the future is looking much brighter. Well, as bright as you can get with the events of Infinity War. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. Please let me know in the comments below what you guys thought of my review of Amazing Spider-Man 2. Are your opinions of the movie still there to this day after watching the movie recently? Or if you haven't seen the movie recently, I would recommend giving it a second look and seeing exactly if certain things do in fact hold up. What were your initial thoughts and impressions of Amazing Spider-Man 2, and have they changed? Post all of your insights and comments in the section below. Make sure you like and share this video. I worked on it an awful lot, so please, I would really appreciate if you guys supported it, and support the channel with more and more reviews coming very soon, some of which are classic ones. Most especially one that I'm currently playing right now, and I'm like, ooh, I can't wait to dig into that one. So please subscribe so you can stay tuned to that. And thank you guys so much for watching once more. I'll see you all later. She gets fully fleshed out here as the more she gets involved with Peter, to the point where it's almost like you start to unwillingly get frustrated with Peter for being such a horny bastard.
I think Liz Allen really is into me. Gwen, too. Gwen, Liz, Gwen.
God damn, I'm surprised Peter didn't go after Flash's mom.
Mom?
Really surprised. My spidey hormones are tingling.